So welcome everyone to our Off-Campus Living Resources Tulane Family Programs webinar. My name is Penny Wyatt and I'm the Director of Family Programs, and I'll be moderating today. We're really grateful that you've joined us today, and we hope that we can provide a lot of helpful information that will guide you in supporting your student in the whole realm of living off campus. We do need to note that Tulane University and the Office of Family Programs do not endorse or recommend any specific apartments, landlords, neighborhoods, or other businesses related to off-campus housing, but we can provide a lot of valuable information by giving you a compilation of resources so that you can help your student investigate options for off-campus housing, have some more context about what the university neighborhood is like, and tell you about different offices on campus that can provide assistance, and we can give you some suggestions for how to approach the search and what to know about that, what makes it different to live off campus, and what is still the same for students if they live off campus. So I am going to just briefly show you this topic outline so you'll see what we plan to cover in our time together here. And then I also want to introduce my colleagues who are our panelists today. They include Lauren Jardell, Director of Local Government and Community Relations, Chris Porceau, who is Program Manager for Community Relations, Catherine Tyner, our Assistant Dean of Students, Troy Williams, who's a police captain with TUPD, Erica Woodley, our Dean of Students, and Christopher Zaccarda, who is the Director of Student Conduct. So again, I'm Penny Wyatt, the Director of Family Programs. I'm going to turn things over now to my colleagues, and I'll rejoin you at the question and answer section. Our first speaker will be Lauren Jardell.
Thank you, Penny. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. So we're going to start off with just a big picture overview of off-campus living and some of the big issues surrounding are going on in New Orleans, both in the university area and then outside of it. So one issue that is still ongoing is the doubles to dorms issue. For those of you who aren't familiar with this or aren't from New Orleans, this is where developers are coming in and buying single or double family homes and converting them into higher density properties and dubbing them mini dorms. The neighbors are very much opposed to these and have been working with the city council to try to prohibit them. One of the reasons is that in New Orleans, it's a rather archaic law, but it is still on the books, is that no more than 4 unrelated people are allowed to live together in one housing unit. So when these residences are converted and they have 8 or 10 or more students living there in dorm-like structures, the neighbors are really upset about the density issues, parking, trash, increased noise that come along with this. So the city council is going to make, I think, a 3rd or 4th attempt to limit these. We expect to see some new limitations in probably the next 4 to 6 months come online. They should not affect students directly. They're aimed more at developers and permitting of these types of developments. But saying that does mean that there's likely to be crunch on student-oriented housing off campus or increase in prices. And some of that's also due to the citywide housing affordability crisis that's been going on for a number of years here in New Orleans. And some of that was exacerbated by Hurricane Ida. So there are a number of issues. On some good news, the city council recently passed a Healthy Homes Ordinance, which includes the creation of a rental property database that's citywide. That hasn't come online just yet, but we'll keep you posted. And it also includes some anti-retaliation laws for tenants who do issue complaints about their landlords or the properties they live in. So A great resource for both parents and students is our off-campus living guide that can be found online at the Tulane Government Relations website. This guide covers everything that we'll be covering today, and goes into some detail on city ordinances as well as university policies that are in effect off campus and on campus. And so those are just some resources. The guide is updated every year and is mailed out to your homes for students who are sophomores or rising sophomores, excuse me. We try to mail it out over the summer in the hopes that students and you as parents see it before students come back for their first semester of their second year. And because we found out that generally students are signing leases pretty early, or within that first semester of their second year. There's been a lot of pressure from landlords to get leases signed early. So that's going on. And then, as always, I think in a lot of cities and a lot of neighborhoods, especially those with colleges and universities, it's important to remember that just because there are other college students living around you doesn't mean it's only college students. So it's important for there to be a balance of the students having independence, which is fun for living off campus, but also the responsibility that goes along with that independence. So everything from maintaining property to taking out trash to working with your landlords to notifying neighbors if you're having an event at your house, that kind of stuff. So those are some of the things that we work to educate students on, and hopefully can share some of that with y'all today.
Our next speaker is Catherine Tyner.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us today. While many of your students may decide to live off campus their junior and senior year, some will decide to remain on campus. So we just wanted to remind you that there's an on-campus residency requirement for first and second year students. As far as capacity and options for students who are rising juniors and seniors and want to live on campus, given the current construction plans, we don't know definitively what the on-campus capacity will be for juniors and seniors, but they're, of course, able to apply for on-campus housing to see if they can get space. There is a application process for the 2023-2024 academic year. The application will be open from mid-January to mid-February, and students will select their rooms for the following academic year for that fall 2023, spring 2024 in mid-March. They should be keeping an eye out in their housing portal for when that application opens. After the selection of the rooms in April, a wish list request process will be opened. So students who may not have received their desired choice of housing, their first selection, can then be added to a wish list should space become available that they can move into. On the housing website, housing.tulane.edu, you can see the returning student room selection process. There's an FAQ. Under logistics, they have the calendar and the forms. And as I mentioned, students should keep an eye out on that housing website and in their housing portal for the application to open. And once it's opened in their portal, they can submit their application. Information for the upcoming academic year will be posted in the coming weeks by Housing and Residence Life. Something to keep in mind when applying for on-campus housing is students will sign a housing agreement, and should they decide to cancel their housing contract, there'll be a cancellation fee, and those fees are assessed to the student's account based on the time they leave. are some instances, such as when students take a medical leave, that you're not charged the cancellation fee. And all of the dates for the cancellation fee can be found on that housing website. Another thing to think of if your student is moving off campus or on campus, on or off campus, is where to store their belongings during the summer. So for on-campus students, we have a partnership with University and Student Services, or USS, to provide storage and delivery services. So students at the end of the spring semester can purchase boxes from USS, pack their belongings, and leave their boxes in the room. USS will then pick up their boxes and put them in storage for the summer, and then deliver them back to campus in the fall.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erica Woodley. I'm the Dean of Students at Tulane, and I have been here for about 20 years. And so I have seen a lot of changes and developments off campus, and a lot of the things that are frankly still the same. And so I'm going to spend a little time talking to you all about what it looks like to prepare to live off campus. And I do know that we might have a mixed audience today, and some folks who are on this call might have students who are coming for the spring semester and planning to live off campus. And if that's the case, and you have very specific questions or need kind of more immediate assistance, you can feel free to email me and schedule a time to chat specifically about your student situation. Catherine Tyner can also help with those kinds of questions, and we'll give our contact information at the end of this. I don't know if you can remember your first kind of independent apartment. I blocked it out because I fumbled it pretty badly. But there are a lot of things that we want students to think about when they're preparing or thinking of living off campus. Our students love to live with a bunch of their friends. And although Lauren has noted that, you can only have 4 unrelated people living in a residence, we'll have situations where, a home has been divided into multiple kind of units, and we'll have, as many as 8 to 12 people living in one building, in separate units, but all living together. It can be really tricky to negotiate living with folks. And we find that students have, struggle with this on campus. And the difference is, on campus, we can be involved, we can help someone move, and off campus we can still be involved, but it's often a lot trickier. And there are financial implications to moving or to making kind of changes. And so one thing that I think is really important is to talk through with your student, the optimal number of roommates that they could have or they should have. And then, as a parent, you can't do this for them, but really encouraging them to sit down and talk about kind of some of the hard questions, like how are we really going to live together? What's this actually going to look like? I am blown away every year. I mean, every year we have a dozen probably people who start out as, best friends, and by the end of the year semester can't stand each other and have to have, kind of no contact orders. And really it comes from a lack of kind of upfront communication and boundaries on the front end. And sometimes some other stuff comes into play. But I think if people are really honest about the kind of living situation that they want and need, some of that stuff can be avoided. You're communicating not only with your peers, but when you move off campus, you have to be able to advocate for yourself with landlords, utility companies, repair people. And then, we are located in a residential neighborhood. And we have a very active group of neighbors who are holding our students accountable in ways that aren't necessarily always super helpful, but they're upset about the way that our students conduct themselves sometimes in the neighborhood. And so, I think in terms of your first sort of off-campus property, it's important to really think about the kind of people who are living around you. They're elderly people, they're people with small children, they're working professionals, and adjust your behavior to consider that. And then the other thing that is true, even though a lot of these off-campus properties are only, a 5 to 10 minute walk from campus, students have a harder time, getting to class. And so they have to make sure that they're allotting the right time, that they're allowing for time to do kind of household chores, like take out the trash, those kinds of things. And I think everyone sort of sees when they live on campus, they see that kind of the freedom and the positive sides of it without really thinking through some of the things that are a little more challenging. You can go to the next slide. One of the first and kind of most important things that happens is your student will sign a lease. And again, I think this is something that I've seen. I see it every year, students who sign a lease that they haven't actually read. And a lot of them are kind of boilerplate leases, and you don't expect a lot of surprises, but there sometimes are surprises. And also sometimes things that just aren't clear in the lease that your student should seek to get in writing. And some of those things are like, who's on the lease? What you really want in a situation is for every student who's living at the property to be on the lease, so that you don't have one student who's responsible for the rent of everyone. And so each student should have their independent lease agreement with the landlord. This also helps when there is conflict. The landlord can help kind of negotiate what happens. You also want to know what's included and what's not included. Most of the leases around here will include some kind of utility like water, but not all the utilities. So not usually electricity or, internet. Some properties include extra trash pickups. And this is particularly of interest to people who live in bigger places. Our garbage service in the city, it happens once a week right now. And if you have, if you have I live by myself and I have one person who makes a whole full garbage can of garbage every week. And so if you think of having 4 people living, it can pile up pretty quickly. And so it's important, especially if they're living in a place with multiple units, to make sure that there's some plan for garbage pickups. And the reason is that when that doesn't happen, neighbors complain about students, and students can get cited for not having their garbage picked up in the right way. And so even though that feels kind of unfair, it is the way it is. So, it's good to ask these questions on the front end. Other things, we have a lot of our properties are older in nature. And so, before you sign a lease, there should be some kind of walkthrough of the property, and students should know what to look for on that walkthrough. So things like, are there smoke detectors in every room? Do all the windows open and close? Do all the doors open and close? Some kind of basic fire safety stuff. What kind of fire extinguisher is provided? What kind of security is provided? These are all things you want to know before. And it's not to say like you can demand that your landlord put in a Ring doorbell and that they have to do it, but you could ask them, or you could at least know that it's something that you're going to want to do before you move in. And so really ask it, like getting all that stuff, even though it's more work on the front end, it's going to be worth it. The other thing that happens a lot is students will walk through a property when someone still lives there, and there's damage that happens. So I always think it's a good idea to ask to walk through their property after before, like when you're looking at the property, but also after the people have vacated, so that you can get a good sense of what needs to be fixed. There's a big problem with people paying security deposits and not getting them back because they find all this damage. And a lot of times our students are saying this was there before, and it just turns into this fight. But if you have pictures and take a good inventory of what it's like when you get it, you can also ask for repairs to be made. I encourage people to get that kind of stuff in writing because, me saying I'm going to fix something, I might not remember saying that. And so it's good to have something in writing. So you can say, no, here on August 5th, you said that you would fix our air conditioner. And then what the policy is on subletting. This is important, even if you don't know it's important. Even if your intention is to never have to sublease, you don't know if you don't know that something won't come up that requires that. You also don't know that one of your students' roommates might not have one of those things come up, and you want to know, and you want to have a good conversation with the roommates before about what are our expectations around subletting. I've had situations where students like basically just get anyone to move in, and then the other people who live there are really uncomfortable with that. And so having a conversation about that on the front end, I think, is really, really a good practice. And then pets are another thing that I think you need to understand what the landlord's expectations around pets are. There is an exception for service animals. And so, if you have that, just be upfront with your landlord about it on the front end. And then finally, like what it means to break the lease. What are the, how do you handle that as a landlord? And asking all those questions up front. I will be honest with you, this is probably going to in some ways annoy a landlord a bit, but it's really important for your students to be able to be good consumers and to know what they're getting into. And the parents' role in this, I think, is really just to help the student kind of manage it. We want to hope and want to think that when students leave Tulane, they're able to do all this stuff on their own. They're probably not really there yet, many of them. And so, being a supportive person in that role and asking the questions, reminding them to ask the questions, I think is the best way to make use of this relationship. We can go to the next slide. We do have a very helpful resource. Unfortunately, students tend to engage this resource more reactively than proactively. Oh, you know what? I forgot one thing. Back up one, Penny, sorry. One other thing that I think is important to make sure is spelled out in the lease is how the landlord will have access to the property. Or the maintenance person. Like, what does that look like? Do they give some kind of notice before they come into the property? And this is important because we have had some people who were uncomfortable with their landlord's kind of entry into their property. And so I think it's a really good thing to say, like, usually they'll say something like, they have to give me 24 hours notice, or, send me an email with 24 hours notice or something like that. And so I think it's a good idea just to be aware of that and have that kind of expectation laid out on the front end. Sorry. Back to TULAP. This TULAP slide reminded me of that because we have had some situations where students go to TULAP because they're having issues with their landlord, and that's one of the issues that has come up. So TULAP is the Tulane Legal Assistance Program, and it's a program through our law school. We have a civil attorney and a criminal attorney who are advising kind of first-year law students, and with some upper-level law students also working in that group. But students can go and they'll review a lease, or if you're having an issue, they can help with a letter to try to resolve the issue. If the student needs kind of more advanced legal services, they can help them get that at a reduced fee. It's a really good service. Again, it's probably better if you have questions about a lease to go on the front end, but they are available for students kind of no matter what stage they're in the process. So apartment search considerations, we spend a lot of time with students on this. And this, is just something that I think it's good for you as a parent to sit down with them and help them kind of understand, like, all of the costs of living off campus. It's not just about rent and utilities, right? Like, you have to figure out your food, you have to figure out toilet paper. I had a student a couple of years ago tell me that he had no idea how much toilet paper cost because he'd never paid for it. He moved, he lived with his parents, and then he moved in to the residence halls, and he was personally aghast at how much toilet paper cost. And I don't even know if he was buying like good toilet paper. So food expenses. Some students who live off campus choose to still keep a meal plan, but a lot don't. I think, with a meal plan, there's some value in just having the ability to be on campus and not have to go home between every class. Transportation and parking. Parking is a really interesting beast, and Lauren, feel free to jump in here, but certain neighborhoods have permitted parking only, and our students struggle with parking in terms of not blocking driveways. If you leave your car in one place too long, it can also be ticketed or towed. And so it's really important that if your student's going to have a car, that they really understand the parking restrictions. The other thing to remember is that a lot of places uptown, when it rains really hard, can flood. And so if you have a Volkswagen Jetta, it's probably, you want to be more aware of parking than if you have an SUV or something that might not flood quite as easily. So I think having a car is, a lot of students really love the freedom that it brings, but it also brings a lot of responsibilities.
Yeah, to go off of what you're saying, Erica, another consideration is road construction. Pretty much most of New Orleans is under some sort of road construction. The city is still spending money for Katrina repairs. And that will likely continue for certainly the next 2 years, but probably into 2026. But this construction has rendered some of our streets, comparable to something straight out of, the Wild Wild West and the 1800s. So I'm talking dirt. You're lucky if there's gravel. There's still potholes everywhere. The flooding can be really intense in these areas. And right now, a good bit of the university area is, those streets are undergoing a lot of construction and repairs. So a lot of students are facing these issues, and they're really problematic. Garbage trucks can't get down the streets, delivery trucks. So if your student has a Jetta, they probably can't get down the street. So it's just something to consider, because it means that you're parking, 1, 2, 3 blocks away from where you live and having to walk home, maybe with groceries, maybe at night, maybe alone. So those are things to really think about when you're thinking about letting your student have a car while they live off campus, and how they're going to be responsible for it. As Erica mentioned, some of the neighborhoods have restricted parking, and this is done on a block by block basis. So it's not consistent across a neighborhood or across a street. So it varies. You might have 2-hour parking on some blocks and not on others. And that means that, if you don't have a tag to be able to park there 24 hours and you're over the 2-hour limit, you're going to get a ticket. And, and we also don't recommend leaving your car parked on a city street over winter break, or, anytime your student's going to be gone, because there is a law in New Orleans where if you leave your car and it doesn't move for 3 days or more, it can be ticketed and towed. And the towing fees to get your car back they start at about $160, and that's not even including the daily storage fee that can be charged, much less getting to the tow yard if you can find it. So, I would recommend that they also look at, commuter parking plans, especially for things like winter break, where they might be gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So those are just some other things to consider when talking about off-campus living.
It really sounds like we're anti-car, and we aren't totally anti-car. We just want to make sure that if your student brings a car, that they know kind of how to manage the car piece of it. There are a lot of considerations, and some are not like what I would call normal considerations. And I am from Oklahoma, where there are a fair amount of dirt roads, Lauren. So I still feel like it's not that normal. The next thing that is, I think, something that people don't typically want to do, but where we are is super, super, super important: renter's insurance. Unless you feel like, if your students' belongings were all sort of gone tomorrow, that you could easily replace them for less than what it would cost you to get renter's insurance, I would encourage you to get the renter's insurance. The one that we recommend, which is on that website, actually was really good about paying over the last year. And so during Hurricane Ida, sorry, I should have said that. And, it's really important to have that in place. They paid quickly, and they required some documentation. I think it's easier if you have it. So that's another thing to think about when you're furnishing an apartment. Save all of your receipts for things just in a folder. And it's good to teach your student to do this. But, I think the hope is that we don't have those kinds of emergencies, but it's always good to have it just in case. And it also, the policy covers a lot of different things that a standard homeowner's insurance policy wouldn't cover in terms of belongings. And so it's a good, it's definitely something that I would recommend. We recommend it, by the way, for on-campus students too. There are certain things like if a hurricane knocked out windows and damaged someone's belongings, our policy wouldn't cover that. So it's important. It's an important thing to invest in. The other thing that is important, and this is also something just to be aware of, we are a city that is impacted by hurricanes. We are also impacted by other kinds of weather emergencies. We are also impacted probably more than some places with what are called boil water alerts. And so, when your student is setting up their place, I think it's really important to think through like what are the things that you can buy in advance that we know students need. So like a couple of cases of water, probably always great to have on hand. Flashlights with batteries, always good to have on hand. Some non-perishable food items that people will eat, also good to have on hand. Those are the things that I think when we have something that requires just sheltering in place or just staying where you are is important. And I think, as you have like a group of people living together, it's also a good idea to talk about like if something happened and we needed to evacuate, how would we do that? I think there's kind of a good, something nice that comes from having, 4 people living in a group. You have like your evacuation kind of pod ready. And you also want to make sure, for some reason, and I think I probably was like this too, but for some reason, students feel that when they live on their own, they really need to get a pet like immediately. Remind them that, if they get a pet, they have to have a plan for what they do with the pet during emergencies, during breaks. And, we had a person, this person was on campus, but we had a person who had a gerbil that she left behind during our last evacuation. She was thinking she was going to be gone a couple days, and it ended up being like, weeks. And so don't worry, we rescued the gerbil, but we would not be able to do that off campus. So, it's just important as your student thinks about kind of setting up their home that they are prepared for the worst. I mean, hopefully, we don't have that. We didn't have anything this year, but hopefully, it's always better, I think, to be a little more prepared than kind of caught off guard. Oh, go back. Sorry, one more thing about emergencies. I'm talking about weather emergencies, but there are also other things that happen. I'm thinking specifically of COVID and when we have to isolate people in place. It's also good to just think of, if something happens, what's our plan for, if we had to be displaced for a night or two, like what are we going to do? If something, if we had some kind of something that didn't damage the property, but that disrupted their ability to live there, like a power outage, something like that. Like, do you have do they have a friend they could stay with? Is there some sort of plan in place that's sort of available at the ready? I think that's another thing, a good thing to talk through. So I have some exciting news. It's not exactly really exciting because it's not ready yet, but it will be. And this also answers a question that was in the chat about a place like to publish or to look for sublets. We will have that. We have contracted with a company called Off Campus Partners, and we're working with them beginning to set up a site that will be students can use to find housing within the area. People will list their properties there. It's sort of like if you're aware of apartments.com, I think it's the same parent company, but this is focused for students and it's going to be limited to students. So a lot of folks right now use Facebook classifieds, the Tulane classifieds on Facebook. And the issue with that is it's not limited to Tulane students. There are other folks who are part of that community. And so the valuable part about the off-campus partners is it's just, it's limited to Tulane students, and students would be able to also through this service be able to search for roommates. So if you're a transfer student who's coming in the spring and you want to live off campus, but you don't have anyone to live with, you could find a roommate, using this service. And hopefully we'll have it up soon. I don't know what the actual turnaround time is, but for sure by the end of spring, it'll be up. I think it'll be up early in spring. So for now, I think it's, there are things you can look at. There are a few local realtors who handle the area around Uptown, and they can walk you through it. I recommend, don't ever sign a lease for anything that you have not seen in person. And so this presents challenges for international students, and I understand that. My advice is to ask the realtor to do a walkthrough of the property with you. We had some folks who signed leases for properties that did not exist. And then they came and obviously had paid deposits to people who were, who were fraudulent. That typically doesn't happen through a realtor. And so that's the benefit of using someone professional versus just going online and finding something yourself. Not all the properties are represented by realtors though. And so, that's another thing we hope to sort of pull together through this new service is the kind of a one-stop shop place for folks to look where they don't have to, to be so conscientious of scammers. Nothing is free from scamming. I'm aware, but it's still better than, just sort of open source bulletin boards and that kind of thing. The best way to find property is to get it from someone else. A lot of these properties are passed down, which is why it's sort of this mad dash to sign leases. But we have students who are living somewhere, and you'll hear that something's open. There'll be a sign out in front of the property, and so students who are looking should just be kind of paying attention and talking to folks about that. The more we also have a few former students who are local real estate agents who are open to helping students, and though we can't endorse them, if you called us and said we really need someone to help us, we would be able to connect you with those. We would give you some choices and you could choose someone. I recommend looking in the 70118 zip code, and if you're living downtown, it's a little more complicated. I think if you're living downtown, I would say my bias would be to look at apartment complexes. There are only a few of those actually, and they're a bit more expensive, but the properties that are downtown, there's a lot of variability in terms of how students live. And so, a lot of students who go to school downtown still live uptown or maybe in mid-city. And so you just have to be a lot more careful when you're going kind of too far outside the campus, the uptown campus. And then for downtown, if you're going to live downtown, if you go outside the areas that are like these kind of complexes, you have to be really careful. Anybody else wants to add about that? Okay, you can go to the next one.
Hey, I think this is Troy's part, or Erica and Troy can talk about this.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Yeah, just as Erica said, the location's important. What I would do right here, this link, I think you guys will get a copy. You can pull up, it's pretty much up to I wouldn't say up to the minute, but it's pretty up to date, the crime data. And you can I believe you can narrow it down to a specific block, if I'm not mistaken. Or you guys, I'll give you my number at the end. You can call me. I'm retired from New Orleans Police Department, and I can tell you my personal thoughts on some of these neighborhoods. As Erica said, there's a lot of scams out there. A lot of these houses you're going to find on like Tulane classifieds on Facebook. They're beautiful homes, but they're not where you want your student to live. And you get a good deal. It's worth it to pay the extra money, I believe, to be, if you're an uptown student, to be uptown, as opposed to one of those other zip codes. But when you do find a place off campus, we do offer, there's virtual escorts, which is by way of the Everbridge app that I believe gets explained to the students. And we also offer escorts to and from. We're not going to bring them to bar rooms and bar hopping and things like that, but we will bring them to class. And if they don't feel safe coming from a grocery store or something like that, we'll pick them up and bring them home. That is something we offer. And then once you do decide on an apartment or a house, you can contact us for the security assessment. We'll have our crime prevention officer go out there, and he'll take a look around and recommend the best practices for keeping your house as safe as possible.
And Lauren, here's your additional information about the off-campus living guide.
Sure. So as discussed earlier, we produced the off-campus living guide, and it goes over a number of ordinances and university policies that students need to remember when living on campus, or even being off campus in general, just expectations the university has of all of us. So it is important to abide, by New Orleans laws. That does include alcohol laws. And while New Orleans is a rather permissive city, You still are not supposed to legally be drinking if you're under 21. Noise and trash are always issues. As Erica said, right now, trash and recycling pickup is only happening once a week. That's likely to continue for the foreseeable future right now. And most people are lucky if they get their trash picked up once a week. So it is very important to pay attention for your students to know the pickup days, or know if they have their landlord has contracted for private trash pickup, which is an option. And to be aware, and to, if they have problems, if they're facing issues that are outside of their control with these things, they need to let us know. That's the best way we can help them, is to let us know early, hopefully before the neighbors start to complain and before city council members start to hear those complaints and want to start cracking down. So our contact information is going to be available for all of us at the end of this. So please feel free to use that, to have your students reach out if they have questions. Most of students aren't going to be doing a lot of outdoor maintenance, we don't think, but they are still responsible for what the outside of their property looks like. And that includes the sidewalk and the grassy area between the sidewalk and the street. So basically they're responsible for the look of their property from the edge of the street up to their front door and inside. So and then one last thing is to be mindful of the neighbors. As Erica mentioned, it's a mix of folks. You have older elderly residents, you have retirees, you've got folks who've got young kids, you might have some young professionals, but a lot of folks are working, and because it's New Orleans, you've got folks who work a variety of hours. So you have some 9 to 5 folks, you might have people who are hospitality workers and are working kind of off hours, might be sleeping more during the day than at night. So just to be mindful of those facts. And I would also point out that TUPD now has noise decibel readers. And so Troy can talk a little bit more about this, but it allows them to better regulate the noise levels, not just during the quiet hours that the city has outlined, but also during, regular daytime hours. There's still a prohibition on how loud people can get and for how long that loud noise can be sustained. And it's 70 decibels, which is not very loud. But if it's sustained for several minutes, that can be a citation. So that's something to be aware of. The neighbors are very sensitive to noise. This area is a pretty dense area and houses are very close together. And so they hear a lot, even when they're inside their homes, maybe with their own TV on, they can still hear stuff going on outside or stuff in somebody else's house. So just that's something to be aware of. But all this is laid out in the guide, which is also online, and we can make sure everybody receives that link.
And I would also say, it does feel like for a couple of years during COVID, things were a bit quieter. And so our neighbors are coming back from that and experiencing, some of the things that were probably, I bet we hear once a week that this is worse than it's ever been. And I think I don't know that it is worse than it's ever been, but I will say that, sort of the lull from COVID coupled with, I think, neighbors' frustrations by the developers who are building, these bigger properties in places where there were previously single family houses. I think the neighbors are certainly on edge, and they do attribute a lot of behavior to our students. And I'm positive that 100% of the behavior probably isn't actually connected to our students, but I will also say a lot of them have cameras, and oftentimes our students are, sort of in their Tulane shirts doing whatever they're accused of doing. And so it's a little hard to be blindly defensive of our students. And so, I think it's just important to make sure that your student understands what it means to be a neighbor, and that just because they're in this bubble that is Tulane and college doesn't mean that they should act the same way they act at your house. And I think that is an important conversation to have.
All right. So from student conduct perspective, I've been asked to speak about the behavioral expectations that we have for our students, and whether that's the students that have moved off campus and are living off campus in the community, as Lauren had described, or maybe it's residential students that are visiting their friends off campus at off-campus places. The Code of Student Conduct applies equally, so both on campus and off campus. It also applies to all of our students, graduate, undergraduate, law, med, part-time students, even our online only students. It also applies during periods of breaks. So we're headed into our winter break. So even though the university may be closed or students may be out of classes for session, the code does still apply during all of those periods, from the time of enrollment all the way through permanent separation, which is either going to be transfer or more frequently is going to be graduation. And so why that is really important is because we partner certainly with TUPD, but certainly other law enforcement offices, and any individual that submits a concerns report outlining possible misconduct for any of our students. Those reports come directly to myself, to the Dean of Students, as well as some other individuals. We review all of them, and those students where there is an allegation, we send them through the conduct process. And so for that behavior, Lauren described some, maybe it's noise, or maybe it's a large party and too many people, or underage drinking, or maybe it's excessive trash. There are a variety of different behaviors that students may engage in off campus that would find themselves meeting with myself or one of my staff in the Office of Student Conduct. So what we ask is that before going off campus, that students make sure that they're aware of the behavioral expectations that we have of them by reviewing the Code of Student Conduct, making sure they understand what it means to be a good neighbor, because if they're in violation of what it means to be that good neighbor, they could find themselves not only with citations or court appearances or city fines, but they could also find themselves with now a disciplinary record that could be part of their permanent educational record, which the last thing we want to do is inhibit somebody's ability to continue in education simply because they were unable to be a good neighbor. So again, that is my ask of you, that you're meeting with your students, making sure they review the Code of Student Conduct and know how to be a good neighbor.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, parents and family members, it is now time for you to type in your questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can in our remaining time. And just a reminder, we will send you a PDF of all these slides and a link to the recording for those of you who registered, and it'll also be posted in our archive online. So let's start to take some questions. The guide has not been mailed to the transfer students for spring 23, but we will give you that URL so that you can look at it online. And I'll make sure that the folks in orientation will also include it in the communications that they're sending to the students directly. And if we've got some extra copies of those, we'll have those on campus as that first week that people can pick up, but it is available online. It's all the same content. And then another question was about studying abroad and subletting. And so what Erica said was really important for students to make sure that their lease explicitly allows subletting, or what the terms of that would be, or that they add it to that and get the landlord to agree and, countersign that part of it. And so students who are abroad in the fall would be able to apply for housing for next spring on campus, but it's on a space available basis. So in the past, they've opened up that application period kind of late fall, sort of past the midpoint of fall, I would say. So it's really important that you're also taking in this information, because your student may still need to look for off-campus housing when they return from a fall study abroad experience. And if you had more questions about that, you could email the housing department at housing@tulane.edu. So
I don't know that they're going to know that information right away. I will say, I think there are some decisions being made about buildings, and we're opening a couple buildings, but we don't know which ones will be offline or being taken down. And so I think as soon as we have a sense of that information will probably be a bit easier to share. But I don't know that it'll be now. It might be a little closer to summer.
But I think that it's important if your student is abroad that they not forget about that.
Yeah.
and Contact.
Yeah.
And do it as early as possible. So they just get on the radar and they're sort of in that queue to get information. Here's a really good question. Do realtors charge a realtor fee, and is it typical to expect to pay first month and security deposit like in New York and Boston? So
You should, yes, students should expect to pay first month and security deposit, sometimes even also last month. So prepare for that in budgeting. The realtor question, it probably varies. It depends on the realtor's relationship with the property owners. Sometimes they get their fees through the property owners, but if they don't, then yes, they'll likely pass that on to your students. So
I think it also depends on whose contract, like who the contract is with. So if you contact them to see a specific property, I don't think you would incur any fees because the person who's listed the property is paying it. But it depends on sort of who's making the agreement with the realtor. It also is true that if you rent a property, even if you're the one who makes the contact, if you rent the property and it's one of the properties they represent, sometimes you can avoid those too.
the next question is about that lease review from Tulane and what the turnaround time would
So
be.
the way that works is the student would schedule an appointment and they would go into the appointment and they would review the lease in the appointment. It's not like someone just goes in through and redlines the lease, like they review it with your student.
The next question is, how late are campus buildings open for off-campus commuter students? And what are the hours for the health center? So this varies from building to building. I can try to send you some kind of typical building hours when I send the follow-up email. But we do have, for instance, in the University Center, which is the Lab and Barnick Center, and it's open in the evening hours, and the library is also open late, for students to have study space. And then different campus buildings that house classrooms are sometimes also open. Some might require that they have to use their card to access the particular building. So they'll find out more about that, but there are hours, there are spaces available in the
Around, yep.
around campus.
And relative to the student health center, it's basically open kind of normal business hours and on Saturdays until noon or 1. But the other thing that is interesting that we added this year is the telehealth option. So students actually have access to telehealth around the clock, so they can log in and be seen by a provider kind of regardless of the time or day of the week.
So the next question was just to confirm, so our incoming spring transfer students will not have housing available on campus, but the students who started as first-year students are, kind of typical first-time first-year students who arrive in August, and those students are required to live on campus for their first 2 years. Transfer students can't always be guaranteed housing, given that those other students, are already there and are in different residence hall spaces already. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
I would just say that when housing has the ability and students want to live on campus, they try to accommodate them. They just can't guarantee it. So it's a difference of a guaranteed versus sort of as space is available option.
So let's see. Next question, different topic. Do students need to file their leases with any New Orleans government office?
They don't necessarily need to, but it is recommended that you file your lease with the Lands Records Division of the Clerk of Court. And Penny, I can send you that information to include in your follow-up email. But I will say most people I know do not record their lease, but for students, I would actually recommend it. It's a little bit of a legwork at the beginning, but should there be an issue with the landlord, should there be a hurricane and something like that happen, it might provide them a level of protection that they wouldn't have otherwise if their lease is not recorded. And that's also a good thing to talk to Tulane about.
Another question is, do you buy renter's insurance for all residents of the house or for each individual? And my experience has been that
Each individual.
person would need to have their own.
Yep.
Next question is, what is Tulane's relationship to the 1315 apartment complex?
That is basically a Tulane property for all
Property.
intents and purposes. It is reserved for Tulane affiliates, primarily faculty and graduate students. But you know, that's something that if you're planning to live downtown and you're a downtown student, you should definitely look at.
And it's also something we've opened up because of the sort of uptown housing shortage to undergrads and given kind of some special consideration this semester for that. There also another question that's coming up. We also anticipate another option that will be available hopefully in the coming days that we can't talk about right now, but we hope to have another uptown option for students who can't get on campus housing at Tulane.
So another question is, are sublets readily available if my daughter hasn't nailed down a place to live after her fall study abroad?
I think they're readily available, unfortunately, for the fall. They are not readily available for the spring because for whatever reason, students tend to skew towards studying abroad in the fall and being here for spring. And so if you were asking the opposite question, I would say yes. I think it's probably a good idea to secure something before she goes abroad.
What are your thoughts about students living alone in a studio apartment?
I think it totally depends on the student. I think there are some students for whom, you know, like they need their downtime and their time away from students, and they're gonna, you know, connect on campus, and there are people who do it beautifully. I think a lot of students find it really isolating, and if they haven't connected to campus, I think it's hard to do that. If it's an incoming student, like an incoming transfer student, or an incoming transfer student, I wouldn't recommend that if it's possible. Or if they do end up in that situation, make sure that you connect to the Office of Case Management and Dean of Students office, so we can make sure to just have like some touch points for that student, so that we know that they're not kind of, you know, slipping through the cracks and not making connections. We can be a little more intentional about that.
And I would add that it also probably depends on the property. If a student is planning to live alone, I would definitely recommend that they have TP look at the property, you know, as another set of eyes, and how secure it is. Like, is it a basement apartment where your door just opens up onto the street or a side alley or a sidewalk or something? Or, you know, do you go through, you know, is it more of an apartment building where maybe there's a front door and then a hallway and then your door, you know, just stuff like that to look at. I would definitely have TUPD look at that if somebody's planning to live alone.
Agreed.
So here's a comment. I believe filing a lease with the appropriate city department also protects tenants if the landlord sells the property during the term of the lease.
That's true.
That is true.
Is it true that we have time to find places for the spring? It's hard to ignore the panic or hype on the parents' Facebook page. So I'll just want to say the parents' Facebook page is not an official communication from Tulane, but we know that there is a lot of communication back and forth between parents in that space. So does anybody want to answer that about how much time?
Are they talking about for this spring or next spring? I'm a little bit confused.
Is it true that we have time to find places in the spring? So if the person
for fall.
You mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think
in the spring to find a place for fall.
there are people who are finding places for this spring right now. I will say it's not easy, and you know, you have to be really on top of things and like looking at what comes open when it becomes open. But I think, you know, there are always places. It might not be exactly where they want. And students, by the way, like by and large want to live like very, very close, like, you know, and I understand that, but there are some places that are, you know, that come available that don't typically rent to students and that aren't on that student schedule. And so we have students who are again, looking for places now for this spring. So yes, they can. And in the spring, we'll be looking for places for the fall. There is a lot there are a lot of leases that are signed in the fall for the following fall, but it is not the only way to go.
Another question, my daughter will be living a 30-minute walk to campus and planning to drive each day. Can we buy a parking permit online ahead of spring semester start? What does parking look like for students on campus? So I will add the link to the parking office and the permit fee structure page in the follow-up emails. But you could, if you want to, go to the Tulane website and search for campus parking and find that information. So there is and it's all online. We don't even have the hang tags that you hang from your rearview mirror. It's all done online and it's checked according to the license plate number on the car by our, but it is required. So to park on campus, you do have to have a permit. In reference to your comment just now about a possible opportunity developing in the next few days, for students who want on-campus housing, will transfer students be made aware of this too? How would that information be shared?
Via email. It will be, yes, it will be shared, and will be shared via email.
And let's see, there was another question. What contributes to Tulane's on-campus housing shortages for transferring sophomores, especially given on-campus is required for freshmen and sophomores?
I think it varies from year to year. And sometimes it's, based on the number of the size of our class, and sometimes it's based on the size of the class before. This year, we have some additional challenges in that we intended to open 2 buildings that are not ready. And so we're kind of locked in the space that we have, which is creating some issues. Those buildings will be open in the fall, but then again, we don't know exactly which buildings will be coming offline to continue the overall, our plan is to continue to expand housing so that we have any student who wants to live on campus has the ability to do that. We're not there yet, but this is part of the kind of growing pains to getting there.
And it can vary depending on how many students go away for spring semester for study abroad or an internship experience in another city. And so there's just it can just vary so much from year to year. So though I think this will be, I'll do a last call for questions. So if you have a burning question still, please type that in. This question is, will selection of RAs for next year be completed by the time the 23-24 on-campus housing applications open up for juniors and seniors? So it won't be completed by the time the housing application process opens, but it will be completed before there's any kind of penalty for canceling any space that they got. So if their housing application was received and they were able to secure a room through this room selection process, either that selection process will happen before the RA announcements, the selection announcements are made, or they'll be in a category where they've got a deadline by which they have to accept that RA position and cancel the housing with no penalty for the cancellation. So they definitely have some time there to allow for those sort of, notices of things coming out that are those commitments for that next year for students. So I don't see any other questions typed in. If I accidentally missed your question, please email families@tulane.edu, and I will get the details for some of these other things to include in the follow-up. I'll get that information about Everbridge, the safety app that students can use that has a virtual escort and some other resources on it. I'll include the information about the TUPD personal escorts and the parking permit information. So we're really grateful that you tuned in with us today. And I want to thank all of the Tulane panelists for your time. And just thank your all of you parents for your participation today and your support of your students all the time. So again, if you have questions, email them to families@tulane.edu or feedback about this webinar or suggestions for other topics. And I thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.